Hope you're ready to learn a little bit about nonprofit in the United States as well as in Europe today. I think you'll understand that it's not that different in managing a nonprofit than it is managing a for-profit company. The overall underlining thing is that the bottom line, as was mentioned earlier, is not the highest market share or for-profit revenues. It's actually for various different topics. And for a museum, and my museum in particular, it's education and history and the history of Boston as a city and its world capacity is really our bottom line. And we get a lot of unique and diverse backgrounds running through our museum every year. And if they can just take a little bit more information out of their stay and their visit through our museum, then we've succeeded. What we do, how we do it, and then we'll move on to the actual strategic planning and the meat of today's lecture. So we're called the Bostonian Society, and that was a name that was given to us by our founders in 1881 to preserve the old State House building from being demolished and moved brick by brick to the shores of Michigan, or of Chicago and Michigan, which doesn't make sense because the Old State House Museum was the provincial government for the British colony of Massachusetts Bay and had been ever since that colony was founded in the early 17th century. We're all familiar with British rule, and it didn't make sense to take it to a non-colony when that's all it was used for. And so all these old, rich Bostonians came together, pulled a lot of money together, and founded the Bostonian Society to keep the building in the city and then turn it into a museum to educate the citizens of Boston as well as the members of the world on the impact of that building and the city to world affairs. So it is a nonprofit, which in the United States means it's a 501c3 company in the eyes of the Internal Revenue Service of the United States government. We are a nonprofit in the public education interest, and our main goal is to preserve the old State House. We'll talk about that a little bit further through the talk. And we do that through a museum. We also have a scholarly research library, and we do offer public programming through lectures, through various types of things. These are the modes and these are the offerings we provide the public in fulfilling our mission and preserving the Old State House building, as well as educating on Boston's history. And it makes sense, it was built by the British. The weather vane on the very top, was constructed by a famous guy named Shem Drown, and it is gilded with 24 karat gold. We just redid that, and it is the oldest weather vane in the United States. It's one of my personal architectural favorites of the building. So this is what we're talking about. Preserving this building, these bricks that are really old is a huge challenge, and we'll talk about that a little bit further down the line. But make note of the buildings that are surrounding it. It's in the middle of the city of Boston, and it's surrounded by massive skyscrapers. And that plays an important part when we look at how we preserve it in its situation in the actual city of Boston. For a whole lot cheaper. So we'll define museums, and the International Conference of Museums defines a museum as a nonprofit permanent institution for the society and its development. It's open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, exhibits for the purpose of study, education, and enjoyment, material evidence of people and their environment. This is a very long, complex definition, but it does encompass the specific aspects of a museum, and as a museum, as a nonprofit, which we will explore those a little later on, and we'll reference them a little later on. And the International Conference of Museums is basically the big governing body of museums all over the world. Coincidentally, the American Association of Museums uses the exact uses the exact same definition, as well as around the world they'll use that definition. So types of museums: art museums, history and historic sites, which is my particular museum, the Old State House. Science, there's a museum of play in the United States. There's National Heritage Museums. I was just at your National Heritage Museum yesterday. There's Sports Hall of Fames. Those are museums. Planetariums are museums. There's a museum of torture that I went to and analyzed in Budapest, which is by far, hands down, the best museum I've ever been to in the world. Statements and both objectives aren't contrasting or directly conflicting with each other, because the underlying message of them both is to both educate, and you can't do that when you're fighting against each other for market share. So Pepsi versus Coke or Coca-Cola compete against market share because they have the same product essentially, and they're vying against each other for market share. But when you have, for instance, another thing, fine art museums, two fine art museums in one area, such as the Met in New York and the Frick in New York, they're both high world-class fine arts museums, and they're very close together on the Upper East Side and of Manhattan, and they don't want to compete against each other because it doesn't help their visitors going to their museums and educating themselves based on art and pursuing, and it further undermines both museums' missions. So concentration of universities, as you know, Harvard is just over the river in Cambridge, but I think there's several hundred in the actual city of Boston itself, universities. So it's just a natural source to go after them. But without knowing who we are, we don't know how to do that, so it just didn't seem correct in pursuing that at the moment. So we put that to rest. So here we go. Target audiences should be desirable and also reachable. That's just without saying. I mean, why would you go after a target group or not? So yeah, I think I'm going to wrap it up. I think I went over a lot, sorry. It's a lot to talk about. Those are the bones of what strategic planning a museum is about. So thank you.
Good morning, sir. I am PROTON Thakur. Sir, I want to ask this, how should we approach people or convince them for donation or funding?
How do you approach people and convince them to support?
Yes, sir, for support and donation.
Through donation?
Yes.
Oh, that's a good question. It can be through any means. There could be a donation box in your museum admission area, which most museums have. You could send out flyers asking for donations or asking for membership support. Most often in a development sense, when you're asking for the big funds, it's through formal grant proposals that the structure of which is created by your institution. So for instance, if you're looking for arts support through the Ford Foundation, the Ford Foundation has a particular process through which you have to go and submit, and they review and they let you know, and it's most corporations, most fund foundations like that have formal structures set up to ask for